Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at HTML lists. This video is part of a larger series of videos focusing on an introduction to HTML and CSS. This video specifically will focus on one type of lists. We'll come back in later videos and take a look at different types of lists and how to style them. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the unordered list. Now you notice here that I have our W3 schools page up. This is just a nice starting point. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the syntax associated with an unordered list. I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain why you would want to put a list on a web page. Perhaps you're wanting to identify different categories of items for sale, or maybe just listing topics, and all sorts of different reasons that you might want to use an unordered list. Much like in PowerPoint, the unordered list uses bullet points. We'll take a look at ordered lists in a later video. And the ordered list comprises of the UL tag, which starts and ends the list, and the LI tag, which lists the individual elements in the list. Now, before we go any further, I do want to emphasize that we're not going to focus too much on the style of the list. Again, just like in the earlier videos, right now, we're going to focus on the structure of the document, in this case, the list items inside of the unordered list and how it is structured rather than how it is styled. So again, much like in our earlier videos, I am using Visual Studio. Whether you're using Visual Studio, NetBeans, VS Code, or any other IDE, including perhaps using Notepad, doesn't really matter. This is, again, just the tool that I am using. You can use whatever tool you're comfortable with. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start off with a blank HTML page. And for a little bit of consistency here, I am going to put a title in here that reflects what we are in fact covering. And so we're going to start with lists, and this is going to be our unordered lists. I'm going to go ahead and add an H1 tag to this body. Again, partially for aesthetics, but also partially for us to keep track of exactly what we are working on. And then let's just jump straight into how do you set up a unordered list. Well, it turns out you can use an unordered list at a number of different levels. You can nest them inside of other tags. In this case, we're just going to use it inside the body. And so you can see here that you could simply select the UL tag, and then inside the UL tag, you are limited into what tags you can use. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and have an LI tag for an individual list item. And keeping this first example simple, I'm just going to have an item number 1, item number 2, and then ultimately an item number 3. And again, just want us to sort of get started with this example. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a H2 tag here. We're going to call this one example number 1. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And we'll go ahead and navigate to the folder that I've been working with. Hopefully, you've also got a folder that you have been putting all of your files in. And we're going to simply call this one lists unordered. And you'll notice here that I am trying to stay away from using special characters, and instead I'm using an underscore to be able to identify essentially what is a space. Now, depending on what tool you're using, you can either use the split view and then take a look at the design view. I've been having a little bit of interesting intermediate problems with Visual Studio here and getting my split view to work with this particular version of Visual Studio. Let's take a second just to close this. Let me reopen it to see if I can get it to work. I'm going to go ahead and split it. Nope. Periodically, I'm having to shut down Visual Studio to get this to work. I'll try to look into what the cause of that is later on. But for right now, what we'll do is we'll simply just open this in our web browser. Again, that's not a big deal. Many of you are probably already working this way. We just have to remember to refresh the web browser every time you save the file. And now you can see here, pretty basic unordered list, not very interesting, perhaps not very aesthetically appealing either. But the idea is that you can see here, you can structure then a number of options. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to improve on this a little bit. The first thing that I want to do is I do want to point out that you do have the ability to do some basic styling within a unordered list, and that is just simply by using the list style type property. And what we'll do to accomplish this is we'll simply go back to Visual Studio. I'm not even going to bother to rewrite this particular list. We'll just change the example number here. And with this second example, then what we want to do is we want to sneak in the style for the list. And so you can see here that basically by indicating the style tag, the style attribute, and then a description of the style. In this case, what we want to do is we want to choose the disk style. That is, by the way, the default. We can also select circle, square, or none. Very little in the way of options with respect to this, but again, this is meant to be pretty simple. You can get more sophisticated with your styling than later on. So again, to delineate a little bit between these two, let's actually try then a different option. We'll go with the circle option. Again, we're going to bounce back to Visual Studio. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here, and we'll just simply replace this then with our circle. And then if you go back over to your web browser and you simply refresh your page, now you should see our example number 2. You can see just a minor difference between the two examples. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to dig a little bit further in this, maybe make something a little more useful, perhaps something for a small business, maybe a little cafe, a little restaurant that would like to be able to list the items that they have grouped by category. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do this wrong the first time so you can see what won't work, and then you'll see that almost immediately with the unordered lists, you kind of have to jump into nesting your individual tags. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make one more copy of this. This will be our example number 3. I did not have that in the buffer like I thought I did. Let's try this one more time. I'm not going to focus too much on the styling, more on the structure for this. And so what I'd like to do is with this example number 3, I'd like to focus on having maybe a number of different items. Perhaps we'll have our drinks, maybe we'll have snacks, and then maybe we'll have something like desserts. Something along those lines. Now, the idea here is that we would like to ultimately list things below here, but if you notice, then when we come back here, we save this and we come back and we refresh our page one more time, that you really don't have the ability to even describe what's under any of these bullet points. Okay, so in other words, what we could do is we could nest for instance, another ordered list inside of one of these bullet points. But even so, you really don't have a way of describing what the bullet points themselves are supposed to be. And so what we can do here to accomplish this, since you notice that we have limited options inside the UL tag, is that we simply come below our H2 tag, and then we'll simply put in maybe a P tag or whatever other tag logically makes sense. And we're just going to put in menu items. You could, for instance, use another H tag. And again, the idea is that we would just simply want to identify what is below the P tag, in this case, in the unordered list. Now, again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over here to web browser, simply refresh, and you can see here that we're starting to provide a little more description of our unordered list. But again, now, if you come back over here, you'll notice that in each of the list items themselves, you can, in fact, add other elements, other tags. And so you'll see here that we pretty much have the full range of options. And then interestingly enough, what you have is the ability, get down here to the bottom in just a second, you do have the ability to simply put another unordered list inside of a list item. You can do any sort of possible combinations. You can have images, you can have hyperlinks, you can have paragraphs, you can have tables, but we're going to keep this one simple for this example. And then what we're going to do is we're simply going to list some of the drink possibilities that we'd like to have in our particular menu here. So we'll start off with another unordered list inside of the list item, for drinks. And then what we'll do here is we'll list now a couple of items. We'll start off with a Coca-Cola. Hopefully that won't get me in any trouble with copyright. We'll follow up with maybe Pepsi. And then how about if we just have coffee, something generic here. And please excuse any typos that I have here. I'm not going to go back and edit this. Much like many of my other earlier videos, y'all probably will see some mistakes mixed in. Let's go for some snacks here. Not really sure what all we could include here, but let's try, for instance, for a list item, let's do a bagel. A list item for a chicken sandwich, and so on. I think you can guess here that I'm a little hungry making this video, which is what prompted these particular topics. And then finally, under the desserts, then we're going to go ahead and introduce another unordered list. And then for the list items here, we'll do a chocolate cake. And how about a pecan pie? Now, you'll notice here that I tried to mix this up a little bit. I have 3 elements under the first unordered list and first nested unordered list, and 2 under the others. There's no magic as far as this goes. You can have however many that you logically need. Then if we save this, we go back over here to our web browser and refresh. A couple things here you'll notice is, first of all, that as you went with the nested unordered list, the identifier in front of the individual list items did in fact change. And so you'll notice that I now have the open circle as opposed to the darkened in circle, the filled in circle for each of the nested items. And again, what we can do is we can play around with this. And so maybe what we'll do is we'll go under the Diet Coke, under the Coke, and then we'll include another unordered list here. Whoops. Let's see how many different ways I can mistype this. There we go. And then we'll have our unordered list, and then nested in here, we'll have our Diet Coke, regular, and then let's just add one more here for a little bit of variety. We'll have our Cherry Coke. And again, the spaces don't really matter, much like in the HTML, in the HTML tables, rather. Spaces are much more for the humans. As far as laying this out, you could have this all listed as one long line, and that would also be perfectly fine. Your browser would have no trouble interpreting that. We're going to go ahead and save this. Come over here to our web browser and again refresh this, and you'll notice that basically what it's doing here is it's cycling through the individual bullet types. Now, I want to do one last example, sort of an abbreviated version of this, just to emphasize that you can in fact put other types of tags in here. So what we'll do is we'll do one more 4th example here, sort of an abbreviated version of our menu. So I am going to go ahead and add another P tag in here with a simplified menu. And then we'll have another unordered list. I'm just going to keep this one to drinks and desserts. So we have, for our first one, we're going to have drinks. And for our second list item, what we'll do here is we'll do desserts. And then to break this up just a little bit here, we're going to go ahead and put our UL in first, our unordered list, to list our drinks. And so again, what we're going to have here is going to be a Coca-Cola, and then a Pepsi. And then for the desserts, I'm going to do, again, sort of a simplified version here. This will be another unordered list. And for the first list item, again, is going to be a chocolate cake. And then a little bit of variety here. We'll do a cheesecake here. And again, structurally, this isn't much different from the previous example, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to emphasize how we can, in fact, introduce other tags. And so in this last example here, let's go ahead and change this up a little bit here. We need to go ahead and add our example 4. So we'll go ahead and add in another H2 tag right above our simplified menu. So this is going to be our example number 4. And then what I'd like to do is inside of each of the list items, I would like to include an image of the given product. And again, we can play around with this as much as we want to, but just wanted to show you the flexibility here. So we'll start off with an image. We'll specify the source. Visual Studio allows for you to just pick this with a file picker. In this case, I'm going to go to my images folder, and I've already downloaded a couple of images here. There's my Coca-Cola. These images are not well sized, so forgive me for this. I'm just going to go ahead and keep this simple. I'm just going to make these each 200 by 200, and they are, of course, going to be a little bit off. If you were to do this, you'd want to spend a little more time on the images, but we're going to do the same thing now with the Pepsi Cola. And so we have, again, our source. I'm going to pick the URL here. And you can see there's my Pepsi. And again, I'm going to do the same height and width for all of these just to keep it consistent. And then we'll start off with this just to make sure that we're on the right track here. If we refresh this, you can see that the images themselves are kind of a little bit shifted all over the place. And part of that is because I have no spacing between the text that was part of the list item and the image. Now, there's a number of ways that you can go about doing this, including using div tags and span tags. But what we want to do is we want to keep this particular example pretty simple and go back to something that we've already seen in an earlier video. And that is, we're just going to sneak in our BR tag immediately following the text for a given list item. Again, this is just meant to show you sort of as a beginner how you can structure your document. And you can see here that now I have a nice image below each of the options. Now we're going to go ahead and finish this out for the chocolate cake and the cheesecake, just so we have a nice completed example here. So if you come back over here to, again, to Visual Studio, you'll notice that where I'm putting this is inside the individual list items. And so we've learned from our mistakes, or rather what we were trying to accomplish here. So we know to include the BR tag after the text. And again, there's multiple different ways that you can go about doing this. And what I'd like to do then is I'd like to simply include my image and source. And then what we'll do here is, again, I've got kind of a couple of images already. And then we're going to keep the height and width similar for both of these. And we have our source. Pick the last one here. And in this case, there's my cheesecake. And there we go. Now, before we leave this, I do want to point out that you'll notice that I'm using relative paths here. I have everything in an images subfolder. I highly encourage you to do that. That just helps you to structure all of these documents that we're going to be saving, and help sort of have an eye for the future as far as structuring your website appropriately. Again, you don't necessarily have to, but this just kind of makes this one a little easier to navigate. And if you come back over here, if we refresh the page, then you should have a pretty nice looking menu. Again, you can see that some of my images are not are stretched a little bit, and that's just simply because the original image was not of the same aspect ratio as my 200 by 200, my 1:1. So again, you want to spend a little more time picking your images. But that's it for this particular example. Hopefully you found this particular video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.